In Sherman Alexie's novel, Reservation Blues, we're met with the universal question: what do you do when you stand at the crossroads? What do you do? It could be a crossroads of two choices. It could be a crossroads of three choices. It could be an infinite number of choices that exist. But at some point in everyone's life, we're faced with the decision that we know will impact our lives down the road. Do we choose path A or do we choose path B? And either path carries with it its own series of consequences, its own series of crossroads that you'll arrive at down the road. Even a music group such as The Clash, should I stay or should I go? That's a crossroads moment. And so from the first moment that Robert Johnson shows up in Reservation Blues, he shows up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. And who's there to greet him but Thomas, the reservation storyteller? We're at a crossroads moment. We have United States blues, deep South blues meeting with reservation blues. So it's a really interesting universal question that Alexie brings up in this text. And he does it by evoking these names. These are some of the names of the characters in this text. They're all secondary characters, but being secondary characters, though, sometimes an author can do a lot more with secondary characters. And what he does is he uses these characters for the purpose of allusion. And what an allusion is it's a reference to either a body of art, a historic character, a historic epoch. It's a reference to something else that carries weight. So for instance, with the name Robert Johnson, the weight that's carried with Robert Johnson's name is his whole mystique. And if you've read about Robert Johnson, you know that it is said that he made a deal with the devil down at the crossroads. So he couldn't play guitar worth a lick. In fact, people made fun of him, they'd hold their ears, they didn't want to hear him. And he went away for 6 to 8 months. And when he came back, he asked to borrow a guitar. And, people said, oh, why do you want to do that? You can't play. And Robert Johnson started playing, and he amazed them all. Now, that's historic fact. The mystique that's grown up around Robert Johnson is it said that he made a deal with the devil at the crossroads, that he exchanged his soul for the ability to play the guitar. So when Sherman Alexie evokes that character, we see the whole idea of making a decision, making an important decision, being at a crossroads moment is evoked in that name. Now, Sherman Alexie also uses the allusion of 3 other historic names. He uses Mr. Armstrong, Phil Sheridan, and George Wright. And surprisingly, they all work for Cavalry Records. Now, Cavalry is a military unit that rides out on horses. So it's kind of interesting because all 3 of those historic characters, Armstrong, Wright, and Sheridan, were indeed cavalry men. And all 3 of those men faced decision points in their life where they could either go on and torture, persecute, kill people, destroy things. So they could take that path of destruction, or they could choose to walk away, and they could choose the peaceful path. Well, we know from history that all 3 men chose the path of destruction. And I just want to give you a little bit of background on each of them for just a moment. General George Armstrong Custer, he's the one who fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He was ultimately defeated there, but he faced a moment in time where when he was at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he was supposed to wait for 2 other militarized units to show up. But instead, he decided to go on the attack. and it ended up being actually a foolish move on his part. He ended up dying there. Because he couldn't wait, but he wanted that glory for himself. He wanted him and his men to go out and attack this band of Sioux. And that was the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Then when we look at somebody like Sheridan, Sheridan was a Union man in the Civil War. And he led the march down the Shenandoah Valley. And what he used on that march was called the scorched earth tactic. Now again, this is a crossroad. This is a point where he did not have to do this, you know, but he agreed to go forward and to do this, which affected his life and his place in history when we look back at him. Then the scorched earth tactic, what that is, as he marched down the Shenandoah Valley, he raised crops, burned barns that may have been full with crops, and he also set loose livestock. So now the people of the Shenandoah Valley, rather than working to defend their homes or you know, live their lives, now they were scrambling to find food. So we see in Phil Sheridan, his historic character, brings in the whole path of destruction. And we see that even at the end of Reservation Blues, because who's the one who's trying to attack Checkers Warmwater when she's in the hotel in her dream. So it's just kind of interesting there. Then we have our other character is George Wright. Now George Wright, he was also a cavalryman. He led an 80-mile march up the Washington Valley. He was fighting against the Yakima, the Coeur d'Alene, the Spokane, and the Palouse tribes. And what George Wright said in his own words, that it was 80 miles of slaughter and destruction. So he chose that path, which is interesting that Sherman Alexie uses Sheridan and Wright, both of whom led a march of destruction through a valley. But Wright has another level that's placed upon him that's tied in with the horses screaming throughout Reservation Blues. You know, we keep seeing this phrase, and the horses screamed. Well, Wright, on his 80-mile march, actually killed, it is said to be between 600 and 800 horses that belonged to the native tribes. So it's another level of destruction that's added onto it, and that Alexie uses very well in Reservation Blues. The other points, the other people who are at the points of crossroad in this text are our primary characters. For instance, we have Thomas. And Thomas knows that he has to make a decision soon. He's at a point of crossroads, and we learn this early on in the text. What's he going to do? He is almost out of the inheritance money that he had received from his parents. So he's going to have to make a decision on what he does. Can he stay on the reservation? You know, the reservation does not hold a lot of opportunities. Sorry for the interruption. The reservation doesn't hold a lot of opportunities, as you've learned. And then also to go to the city to start afresh is a whole nother thing. And we do know that in the end, ultimately, that's what he and the girls decide, that they are going to go and start fresh. And the horses are running beside them. So we have the movement of horses, that forward movement in a positive direction. Victor, on the other hand, he comes to the crossroads. Once Junior is gone, how does Victor face life alone? What does he do? Every day he got up and he rode in Junior's water truck with him as a friend. And now he has to face life alone. So what path does he choose? And we see that he chooses the path of destruction. He just drinks himself into oblivion. And that's his path. And then Junior, I think he's the one for whom Reservation Blues is really written. Junior tried to make something of himself. He tried to fit into dominant culture. He went out to college, to try to earn a degree. He met and fell in love with this white woman, had a baby on the way, was devastated when she decided to have an abortion. He comes back to the reservation. Here he is for having gone away to college, and all he could do is drive the water truck. So there's a little spark of excitement when, he could play in the band. But when the band dissolves, it's just another hit, another something to weigh him down. And so he has those reservation blues, and he chooses, as you all know, ultimately perhaps the saddest choice to make, because there is always hope. There's always, at the crossroads, there is a point where you do make a decision, and he chose the path that ended abruptly. And that's not a good choice, because you don't know what's down that other path. You just needed to go down that other path, Junior. You just want to shake him in this. But Alexie is doing something with this. I mean, he's showing the real desperation on the Spokane Indian Reservation. He's showing what these people face, and he's doing that through his characters. And he does that very interestingly. However, he also uses the idea of music. It's said early on in the text, on page 10 in my edition, that music created and recreated the world daily. So it becomes a healing salve. It becomes something that you can go to music to receive that refreshing, to receive that healing. When you think you can't go on, it moves you forward a little bit more. But then we have the crossroads of the music industry itself. Is it healing and cathartic, or is it a source of income? Is it a way to make money? So you see the artifice in the music industry. Essentially, we're going to take these people off the Spokane reservation, and we're going to market them as Indians. Here's a real Indian rock band. And it's kind of what Hollywood did to Native Americans. If you look at the old Westerns, Native Americans are always pictured in war garb. They're grunting, they have the war paint on. Instead of picturing them for who they are, as thinking human individual beings with a life force and power. So that's another crossroads that Alexie layers into the text. At what point does music stop being healing and starts to being used, for net gain, for profit? So there's the path of destruction, and then there's the path of life. We also have Big Mom saying that music is supposed to heal. It's not supposed to be taken and destroyed. It's a healing force, and we see that throughout this text. And then we also have, finally, we have Robert Johnson. When we look at Robert Johnson overall, we hear his story, and we hear that he traded in his freedom, is what he says in the text. Now, this is the character Robert Johnson, not the historic Robert Johnson, but he traded in his freedom in order to play. And at that point, we have the horses screaming. The idea of choosing the path of destruction causes the horses to scream. But what's interesting about that is, even with the horses screaming, what Big Mom did, is when she came across the bones of the most beautiful horse that ever existed, what did she do with those bones? She made a flute to make music. So even in destruction, music can be cathartic. And so the overarching question of what do you do when you're at the crossroads? What decision do you make? Is nicely layered into this text. And Alexie uses really 4 things to do that he ties around that question. He ties around the question of what to do at the crossroads with music. He wraps it up with horses. He wraps it up with historic characters. And he wraps it up with, essentially, would you make a deal with the devil? And that's when the horses will scream. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the book.